Let me read to you a brief passage from the 9th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 14 to 15. It's the Gospel for Friday after Ash Wednesday. John's disciples came to Jesus and said, "Why is it that we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not?" Jesus replied, "Surely the bridegroom's attendants would never think of mourning as long as the bridegroom is still with them? But the time will come for the bridegroom to be taken away from them, and then they will fast." Well, what does that suggest to us? Our gospel scene shows the disciples of John the Baptist coming to our Lord with a point that perplexed them. They did not see in our Lord's disciples certain elements of strictness of life observed by them and by the Pharisees. For instance, our Lord's disciples did not fast. Why was that? Our Lord in response did not deny that his disciples did not make a notable point of fasting. They did not fast as much as the disciples of John and the disciples of the Pharisees. Nor did our Lord deny that fasting was important. His reply here was, one thing at a time. Now was not the time for his disciples to fast in that fashion. The time would come when they would indeed fast, and that would be when he was gone from their sight. The important thing for his disciples was his presence among them, and their learning deeply from his teaching and coming to a firm faith in him. He likened the situation to the presence of the bridegroom. Surely the bridegroom's attendants would never think of mourning, would never think of fasting as long as the bridegroom is still with them. Fasting, that is to say, would be a distraction from what we might call the main game, which was to be filled with the person of Jesus, to get to know him and who he really was, to understand his true mission in the world, and above all, to attain to a personal and profound faith in him. Our Lord's reply reminds us that the object of the Christian life is the person of Jesus himself. All else that finds its place in our religious life must have the person of Jesus as its nerve center and must aid us in our relationship with him. Prayer, fasting, and works of mercy must flow out from our relationship with him and sustain, strengthen, and support it. Intimately connected with this very point is the significant word which our Lord uses to denote his very self in this passage. He is the bridegroom, and his disciples are the bridegroom's attendants and friends, our Lord says. They are in his company as he arrives for the wedding. That is to say, our Lord is telling the good-willed disciples of John that in him the longed-for moment in God's dealings with his chosen people has arrived. The time for the wedding has come, and the bridegroom has arrived. In referring to himself as the bridegroom, our Lord was conjuring up in the minds of his listeners the figure of the bridegroom in the prophetic literature of the Old Testament, such as in the prophet Hosea. God is the bridegroom, and Israel is his spouse. He is the husband, and his chosen people is his wife, and all too often an unfaithful wife at that. One can even see a hint of this notion in the very name of Yahweh, which God revealed to Moses as his name. God is the transcendent I am, but as one who is always there in the midst of his people. Like, we could say, a husband always present to his wife. The entire Old Testament looked forward to a time when there would be a true marriage between God and his people, a covenant of love, and when a heart of flesh would replace the heart of stone in the people. God would be Emmanuel, God with us. In veiled fashion, our Lord is insinuating that he is the bridegroom of the Old Testament, come to effect the marriage. It would be effected in his blood, in his death and resurrection. Then he would be taken away from them, and then indeed they would fast. So our Lord's words in today's brief passage place the person of Jesus at the center of the life of the entire church and of the life of every Christian. Let us resolve to make our religion a religion of love, because God is love, and he wishes there to be a relationship of love between him and us. Pope Benedict, in his Lenten message for 2007, makes the point that God's love is both agape and eros. He loves with a love that serves us in totally disinterested fashion, and yet he is profoundly interested in gaining our love. He wants us to love him. He is the bridegroom, we the church, his bride. Let us ponder on this and live accordingly.